So when I look at the front of this, the imitation of the front of this intake looks extremely similar to the X32. We'll get to a little bit more into that here in a second, and I'm gonna tell you why the intake that I see right now wouldn't work. I do not think this intake would work, and I'll tell you more why in a second. What's up, Jet Team? It's Ryan. Welcome to the channel. If you haven't been here before, I'm a former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot. Today we're going to be breaking down the SU-75, and I'm going to tell you from a fighter pilot's perspective if I think this thing is truly a competitor with the F-35. We're going to talk design elements of this bad boy that was made by a little-known aeronautics company in Asia called Sukhoi. So we're gonna discuss why they came up with this design, where maybe they gained a little bit of inspiration, and then ultimately, if you stay to the end of this video, I'll do some final wrap-ups on whether I think this beast could compete with the F-35 and what might change if we see this thing actually roll off the production line. Before we get into that though, if you would, just dominate that like button for me, maybe even subscribe. Every time you like and subscribe, someone somewhere in the world pulls 9 Gs. It's a fact. Let's dive in. Here we go, guys. Looking at this bad boy, single engine stealth fighter. It's obviously got some radar guided missiles and some heat seeking missiles hanging on the pylons. Now, ideally, you would have the capability to jettison those if you got into a position where you needed the stealth characteristics to work. Looking at the cockpit here, you can see there's some similarities to the F-35 cockpit. Obviously, the canopy is going to open in the traditional direction because there is no lift fan, short takeoff and vertical landing variant of this Su-75. But it's got some nice glass screens in there, as you can see, and we'll get more into that in a second. It's got the traditional canopy bow. I'm not a fan of the canopy bow. Sorry, F-15E, I still love you. But at the end of the day, the Viper and just having that bubble canopy like the Viper and F-22 have, to me, it's just like, why not? Why not have maximum visibility, especially when you're thinking about jumping into a dogfight? And then looking at the back of this bad boy, we've got that single engine configuration with the sawtooth nozzles. Now we'll look at some concept photos here in a second, but the sawtooth nozzles, what those are gonna do is reduce the heat signature. I don't know if Russia would actually build new engines for this. I would say they'd probably use some of the traditional engines that they have right now on like the Su-57 or some of their other jets, like a Su-35 or something like that, just due to limitations in engine manufacturing. However, this looks really sharp. It reminds me of an F-35 engine, and all day long, I would just live inside that thing. This is just a solid looking engine. Let's continue. All right, scanning around the side of it, just a nice looking jet. You know, ultimately, like we talked about before, it's got definitely aspects of the F-35, but ultimately, it's also got a little bit of its own flow with that delta wing. So delta wing, that's a debate that we'll have right now. So here we are, guys, looking at that delta wing configuration. Now, you're probably wondering to yourself, where are the elevators? Where are those flat plane control surfaces on the back end of the jet that traditional fighters have? Well, they gone, they're not there. So what they have instead are rudder vaders, and those are essentially those angled twin tails on the back. It's called a V-tail. Now, it looks more futuristic. So when you see any concepts of like a Su-57, the Su-75, some of the X-32s, F-35, some of the original competitors, the YF-23, these jets have these twin tails, and I'm convinced it's just because it looks futuristic. And when you're trying to grab attention and show people, look, we're creating the next generation of fighter. No, don't look over here. That maybe it doesn't work exactly how a fighter should. It looks cool. And ultimately, sometimes when you're building prototypes, you gotta do that. You gotta get attention. So at the end of the day, these are rudder vaders. So those twin tails are gonna act as rudders. They're gonna have control surfaces on the back that will move the plane side to side in the yaw motion. And that's just a fancy way, yaw, if saying moving side to side like this. But then rudder vaders can also help the plane pitch up and down. Not well though, in my opinion. I think there are way better ways to have a plane pitch up and down than using differential rudder Vader type stuff, which is just super dependent on the interconnectedness and complexity of flight control systems. And that goes with a delta wing as well. With these delta wings, we're gonna look at some pictures in a second, so I'll save a little bit of the discussion for the delta wing when we look at those. But ultimately, I want you to think about twin tail, V-tail. Is that really the best setup for a fighter jet, especially something that we're going to potentially export to other countries? I would say no, but let me know in the comments what you think. Let's continue. I mean, it's got a nice design, nice shape. From this position here, we can see that intake, guys. It's kind of got a similar intake to what the X-32 has. And I'm sure Sukhoi took some of their inspiration from the X-32. And I'm not hating on them for that. It's smart. When you see someone who's created great designs, like the West has created excellent designs for fighter jets, probably worth taking notes. There's actually a quote from Steve Jobs, and he says, "The best artists steal," because he's essentially saying it'll save you time. If you see someone who's crushing it, you see an artist or a designer who's just dominating it and they're cranking out epic works of art, excellent fighter jets, then if you disregard that, it's gonna be at your peril. So the fact that Sukhoi is taking notes from the X-32 and the shape of that intake and the overall shape of the jet for the F-35, they're not hiding it. They're not ashamed. They're not like, oh, hope no one notices. They're like, yeah, we're gonna create it that's a similar variant of that prototype, and then we're gonna add our own stuff onto it. So for them, they're saving themselves a ton of time. So I see a lot of comments that they're hating on Sukhoi for this, where, hey, you just gotta call a spade a spade. Of course they're borrowing from it. China's borrowing from a lot of the Western fighters for their jets as well. Now, do we get stuck on that? No, now we just build something cooler. And that's how it works. Honestly, what they say is imitation is the best form of flattery. So when I look at the front of this, the imitation of the front of this intake looks extremely similar to the X-32. We'll get to a little bit more into that here in a second, and I'm gonna tell you why the intake that I see right now wouldn't work. I do not think this intake would work, and I'll tell you more why in a second. Let's continue. So as we continue to just take a peek at this jet, guys, let's look at it versus the F-35. So this is obviously a vertical landing coming in from the F-35. And just looking at some of the design elements, you can see the intakes on the side. There's actually a pretty good amount of space between the fuselage and those intakes. You can see that big gaping hole there in the side of the F-35. Whereas on the SU-75, it's a lot smaller on the sides and it's more of a chin intake is what that's called. An undercarriage intake is like what you would see on the F-16. This one's a little more further forward, so that's why it's called a chin intake. Now, ultimately, I think this chin intake is a little too small. So here we go, guys. Now we're looking at that SU-75 next to the X-32. Now the X-32, if you don't know, it looks like a guppy. But besides that, it was the competitor with the F-35. Obviously the F-35 ended up winning out, and the short story on that is they needed actually two variants of the X-32 to do the short takeoff and landing and to do the vertical landing as well. The F-35, they just needed one. They're able to engineer that lift fan into the back and make it all come together. But if you look at these two next to each other, I want you to focus on that chin intake. And I just like to say chin intake. It's just fun. Go ahead, give it a try. I'll wait. So ultimately though, that chin intake is gonna need to be really big. It's gonna need to suck in a ton of air. That's why on the F-16, on the Viper, we call it the wide mouth intake, because that bad boy just hoovers up air. And I'm reminiscing right now of pulling 9Gs and accelerating at 420 miles per hour. Oh, that's fun. So sorry, I might need a second here. I might need to hit pause. But when I look at that intake on the Su-75, it's too small. So there's not gonna be enough air that's gonna be able to be sucked in by that. The reason why the X-32 had such a big intake isn't because they were like, hey guys, how do we make this jet look as ugly as possible? How do we make it look like a guppy? No, they're like, look, we need this volume of air to suck into this massive engine because again, it's one motor. You've got to make sure that thing is a powerhouse. So you've got to get a ton of air into that. Now it looks better if I look at the Su-75 having that part smaller. Design element wise, it looks better. Trust me, I would much rather, if I brought a date back, I would much rather show her the Su-75 than the X-32. But ultimately, you got to have an engine that works. And the way to get an engine that works is to have the appropriate and proper amount of airflow that goes into it. Otherwise, you're going to run into so many different problems, least of which would be that this thing would be underpowered if it's not getting enough air in. The second would be potential for more compressor stalls, because if airflow gets low at certain regimes of flight, especially in dogfights, and this little teeny intake on the SU-75, think of it being straight up and down, where it's trying to suck in air from not a straight ahead profile where the air is being rammed down, it's gonna be really hard. So the X-32 needed that big intake, and my thoughts are if they produce this Su-75, they're gonna increase the intake, or what they'll most likely do is they're gonna split the intake into two, put them on the sides of the fuselage like the F-35, and potentially add another engine, but more on that in a second. But again, I think the overall flow and concept of this CGI trailer looks really good. And it's almost unfortunate that ruddervators don't work very well, because it does look really cool, especially with that sawtooth nozzle configuration. It just looks ultra futuristic. So this bad boy is gonna obviously be able to harness some weapons inside its internal bays, but ultimately with stealth fighters, you're gonna wanna have the ability to put hard points on them. This thing can pull 8 Gs from what they say, and obviously that is limited probably by the pilot. Now there are gonna be pilotless versions of this as well. So will those be able to pull 15, 16 Gs? Potentially. It would be smart for them to obviously design the airframe to handle that, so that when you take the pink body out of the jet, that thing can pull more Gs. Sukhoi is also saying that this thing can go 1.8 Mach, or maybe even a little faster, over into the 2.0 Mach regime, and that it can also super cruise, which is essentially a fancy way of saying it can go supersonic without putting the engine into afterburner, therefore getting better fuel performance and turning this thing into a Prius. Well, you know what I mean. And guys, I'll leave you with this picture of the Su-75 versus the Su-57 cockpit. Obviously, Russia likes the center stick. For me personally, flying the F-15E with the center stick, not a huge fan. I would much rather have the side stick of the F-16 or the F-22 or the F-35, just for visibility reasons. Being able to see those screens in front of you when you're pulling 9 Gs is hard sometimes. And when you've got this big stick in there, sometimes you're like looking over it, looking around it, just not cool, just gets in the way. But ultimately Russia loves the center stick, so that's what they're gonna stick with. It looks like obviously a ton of glass in there, which I love. It's got a traditional heads-up display, so as far as F-35 situational awareness, it's gonna beat this bad boy, just due to the fact that the HMD in the F-35 is so integrated. You can see through the jet. It literally superimposes a compass over the entire Earth. So that's gonna be an advantage for the F-35. But I think it's really cool what Russia's, doing with this. They've got the upfront control there with touchscreen buttons, which I like, as long as those things are user-friendly when you're trying to reach up and kind of touch something during like pulling Gs or maneuvering or something like that. That's something that I did like about the push buttons, was the fact that I could tell when I pushed it, because there's tactile feedback. The buttons actually give you a little bit of an indentation feel, so you actually hit it and pressed it. So I could put my hand up there, be looking over my shoulder, hit it, and then be turning at the same time, and I would know that I actually did that actuation. So it's a little harder with the touch screens, but if you're flying straight and level and you're using this thing more as a sensor, getting up to altitude using that ASA radar or whatever they've got inside this thing, it's pretty cool as well. But you know what, ultimately, I just wanna say from my pilot's perspective, obviously I'm biased, Western fighter pilot here, but if, Sukhoi, you want me to take this thing out and rage around for a day, let me know, would be happy to. They're sitting there rolling their eyes right now. But either way, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. Thanks so much for checking it out. Hit me up on Instagram. Let me know if there's any other subjects you want me to break down. I'll probably be breaking down some Russian fighters, some Chinese fighters, just because I want you to know my perspective on it, and it's fun. Before you go, if you would, just dominate that like button, maybe even subscribe. Every time you like and subscribe, a good-looking fighter jet is produced somewhere in the world. Thanks for being here, guys. Most of all, have a great day.